When it comes to the many forge rules that form the Adeptus Mechanicus as a whole, there are naturally differences between how each of these disparate planets and systems operate. These are seen both in their approach to manufacturing, but also in their more militaristic aspects. However, when it comes to fielding these on the tabletop, beyond a handful of special rules and different paint schemes, there is little to differentiate these forge worlds. So, in this video, and hopefully in others to come, I hope to add a little difference to how these models look on the tabletop. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to convert and paint the Skitarii of Forgeworld Lucius. I've given this guide a difficulty rating of 2 dead armor bits out of 5. There will be some modification of parts and a little sculpting, but only a couple of extra parts are needed from other kits. Forgeworld Lucius are well known for their mastery over teleportation technology. Not only are they capable of teleporting entire titans into battle, but they can bring their rank and file to exactly where they need them in an instant. It was this affinity for teleportation that I wanted to focus on with this conversion. So to kick things off, I started with the backbone of the Admech, the Skitarii, and I set about removing the parts required to build the torso and legs before cleaning them of any mold lines. Even with their level of skill, teleportation is still fraught with danger. A few misplaced decimal points and your squad can find themselves now a permanent part of the ground. To mitigate these dangers, it made sense to me that the Skitarii of Lucius would strip back their gear to have the smallest possible profile. This included the flowing robes. To remove these, I began by sawing my way through the back half of the torso, keeping my saw blade parallel to the waist joint. I then reassembled the two halves together and used this as a guide to clip away the front halves of the robes too. Once removed, these cuts were cleaned up with my knife. This resulted in a much shorter jacket, drastically reducing the silhouette of the Skitarii. With this first trim completed, I glued the two torso halves together and attached the legs to them. The only problem with removing the cape was that I now had to deal with the right thigh missing a portion of detail. This had been flattened out to allow the cloak to sit against it, but as it was now exposed, it needed fixing. This was done with green stuff. I began by cutting and rolling out a small amount before placing a sausage-shaped blob along the thigh and around the knee pad. With my sculpting tools and plenty of Vaseline to stop things sticking, I began to blend this lump into the cloth of the leg. You don't need to do anything fancy here. We're just looking to build up the thigh so it's more a normal shape. I also recreated half of the knee pad as this was also missing. However, I didn't worry about the thigh armor. I will be covering this area up with a slight reduction in armor, simply builds on that light infantry aspect that I was looking to create. While I waited for that green stuff to cure, I could work on other parts of the model. Following on from the earlier weight and size reductions, the head was the next part to fall under the knife. As I was building the vanguard flavour of Skitarii, I grabbed one of the helmeted heads and began to shave away that centre ridge. This was quite a small adjustment, but that fully smoothed out helmet does help to give the head a slightly different appearance. Next up were the arms and the weapon they carry. With the removal of the robes, the loose sleeves didn't quite work anymore, and so these needed to go. I removed the bulk of the hanging cloth with my clippers and then rounded things out with a knife to create a more of a jacket sleeve look. Once I completed it on one arm, I repeated it on the other. I could then turn my attention to the radium carbine itself. This weapon is a shorter, more up close and personal variety of the radium Giselle, and it was still a little too bulky for me. To shorten down the length a bit, I first of all separated with the protruding barrel. I made a cut just behind where it starts to flare out. With the barrel removed, I then clipped away the stock, removing just the top half where the coils were. This left the grip and the point where the hand attaches alone, which meant I could still easily attach the left arm. I then cleaned up and flattened out the contact points with a mixture of a knife and a file. I made a few comparisons during the step just to make sure that the barrel was sitting nicely against the stock. The problem with reducing the length meant that the magazine was looking a little too oversized, so I also clipped away the last two segments. With this done, I could glue the barrel to its new location. By this point, the green stuff had cured, which meant that I could glue both the prepared arms and head to the torso. Next up was the backpack. I was pretty happy with the original component, but I did opt to remove the hanging cable in order to tighten things up a little bit. After removal, the pack was then glued to the torso. By removing the robes, I now had quite a lot of space to add some handy storage bits. I grabbed a pouch from the Infiltrator kit and used some superglue to attach this over the green stuff. For the remaining areas around the waist, I used a combination of components taken from the Skitarii kit and the Cadian kit, and glued this into place with just regular plastic glue, completing the conversion part of this guide. To make painting the Skitarii a little easier, I glued him to a base so that I had something to hold onto. In addition to this, I also ripped up a few chunks of cork floor tile. These are excellent for creating realistic looking rocky outcrops really easily and really cheaply. These were superglued to the base, and by adding these at this stage, it meant that I benefited from the primer in the next step. The first step in any painting process is priming. This important first layer creates a uniform colour to paint up from, whilst also creating a much better surface for your paint to adhere to. How you apply this primer isn't important, but the colour often is. For this model, I chose to use a grey to help with some of those silvers and those brighter colours. I personally used a mixture of Vallejo black and grey surface primers through my airbrush, but the aerosol or brush-on varieties of primer would have worked just as well here. When painting models that feature a lot of metallics, I generally prefer to start with these first. Metallic paints can be trickier to tidy up if they make a mistake, so it's great to get them out of the way nice and early. I chose to use some lead belcher, but before I applied it anywhere, I added a little water to the paint on my palette. I did this in roughly 1 part paint to 1 part water, which made the paint much easier to apply. This base coat was applied to all of those metallic areas of the model, which includes the armor, the weapon, and other smaller details about the Skitarii's person. After the first layer, I then applied a second to really improve the coverage and to boost that metallic sheen. Once you're done here, don't forget to clean your brush and change your paint water. You don't want those metal flakes getting into your other paints. Lucius features an armor that is much darker than that used by Mars, so I really needed to tone down the brightness here. To do this, I chose to use some of the contrast paint Black Templar, but I didn't want to apply it too strongly. So I mixed in a little Lamium Medium, which reduced the viscosity of the paint a little. Again, that 1-to-1 mixture of paint and medium works well here. This mixture was then applied over all of those areas that I had tackled in the previous step. This paint not only flowed into the recessed areas to create some shading there, but it also stained the surfaces. I allowed this first layer to dry and then tackled it again with another layer, which really darkened things down, resulting in a blackened steel effect. To give those armor edges a little more definition and to boost the contrast between them and the darker recesses, I applied some edge highlights of Stormhost Silver. By dragging my brush carefully along the edges, I left behind a thin line of the brighter silver, which just helps to sharpen that edge. Lucius Skitarii also features some golden adornments, and these were tackled with some Retributor armor. A lot of these areas are quite small, such as the detailing in the carbine and the edging of the armor, so just make sure to take your time here. To finish off the metal, I gave the golden areas a wash of Agrax Earthshade. This was applied straight from the pot, and much like the Black Templar contrast paint, is a great way to add a little recess shading. But by using a brown wash instead of a black wash, we help to retain some warmth in that gold too. As I was applying this straight from the pot, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't pull this up too heavily in any one place. With the metallics completed, I could begin work on what used to be the robes. For Lucius, the robes are a slightly darker red than used by Mars, so I began with some Gal Vorbak red. As with all of my base coats, this was thinned and applied in a couple of thin layers. Once I had a good starting colour, I could build up some more of the details. My first step in doing this was to mix some of the Gal Vorbak red with some Wazdaka red. This created an approximate shade between the two colours, which would help to smooth out the transition between them. This mixture was then applied to the raised folds in the jacket. I avoid applying the mix into the creases or the areas on the undersides of the arms, and by doing so, I began the first step in bringing out those details. This was then continued, but with just Wazdaka Red. I applied this brighter red to the same areas that I was focusing on before, but I reduced the area that I covered a little bit, applying the paint close to the peaks of those folds. Then, just a few spots of Wild Rider Red were applied in very thin highlights to only the most prominent points of the creases and folds, which created a degree of sharpness to them. But I wasn't done with the red just yet. To push those shadows just a bit further, I turned to another paint, Shinish Purple. Instead of being applied all over like I did with the Black Templar, I instead focused just small amounts into those deeper recesses and folds and to the undersides of the arms. This dark purple tone will subtly adjust the red and help darken it down while still retaining the degree of reddish colour. I could have used a black here instead, but this wouldn't have been quite as subtle. For the black areas of the miniature, which mainly consisted of the pipes and leather detailings, I started off with a base coat of Abaddon Black. This was followed up with a layer of Corvus Black. Like with the red areas, I focused my application to just the raised areas and kept the recesses black. The edges of the black areas were then highlighted with some dark greyish blue of Dark Reaper. And finally, some small dots of the light rust grey were painted onto some of the corners and sharper details. One of the more defining differences between the Lucius scheme and that of Mars are the colour of the trousers. Instead of black, I chose to use the cream coloured base paint of Morghast Bone. Again, a couple of thin layers were used to create a smooth finish. To give the fabric on the trousers a little more definition and to darken down the lighter colour a little, I opted to use a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Make sure to spread that wash out evenly across the surface. With the wash already creating a bit of shading, I still wanted to push this a bit further and create the appearance of dirt and grime, so I added some water to some Rhinox hide to create a wash-like consistency. I applied this paint to the recesses and undersides of the legs and steadily built this up. I allowed this to dry and repeated it until I was happy with the strength of the shading that I had added. Finally, I added some fine edge highlights with some Screaming Skull, but while the model itself was completed, I still needed to work on the base. The rocks already had a dark grey colour from the primer coat, but I wanted to pick out those edges, and the easiest way to do this was with a process called dry brushing. With a fairly large brush like this one here, I dipped it into some Dawnstone and worked the paint through the bristles by wiping away the excess onto a piece of paper towel. Now that the brush only had a small amount of paint in it, I then lightly dragged the bristles over the rocks. They left behind a paint just on the raised details and not the recesses. This is essentially a quick way of building up highlights on highly textured surfaces. The rocks, however, were just half the base. To fill in those gaps around them, I used some textured paint, specifically some of Vallejo's Dark Earth texture, but feel free to use whatever texture paint you have to hand. This is a thick, paste-like substance, and it was carefully painted around the feet and the rocks. Once the base was covered, I let it dry fully for an hour or so. The paste helped to fill out the base nicely, but the final few paints were just to boost that texture a little further. The first was an all-over wash to both the earth and rocks alike with some Nuln Oil. Once this had dried, I then did a little more dry brushing. I used some Steel Legion Drab this time around and focused the application to just the earth texture. I then cleaned up the rim of the base with some Abaddon Black before applying a coat of varnish. I used a matte varnish, which meant that I not only sealed in and protected my paintwork, but I also helped to reduce the shine that the washes had left behind. I applied this with an airbrush, but like with the primer coat, using a brush-on or aerosol-based varnish would have worked just as well too. So, with everything done, let's take a look at the finished miniature. And here we have the completed Skitarii Vanguard from Forgeworld Lucius. The light infantry style that I went for here has created something a little more distinct from regular Skitarii, but the model is still something that can easily be recognised on the tabletop. It was also a challenge to limit the number of additional parts that I need to use here. Apart from a couple of extra pouches, everything used in this video can be created with just your regular tools and some green stuff. So if you enjoyed this guide and would like to see another conversion and painting tutorials for the other Forge Worlds, leave me your suggestions for which one you'd like to see me tackle next. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Gesteigpanzer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Raphael Beiruthi, Nice OJ, and Swedsman. So, a big thank you to you guys, and if you are also a supporter of me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then your help is what allows me to buy the kits and materials required to build these kinds of conversions for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.